About 6,000 years ago, in the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a remarkable
people rose from obscurity and changed the course of human history in a region that would later be called Mesopotamia. They constructed the world's first true cities, dense urban centers filled with temples, markets, workshops, and towering monuments that dominated the horizon. They developed the earliest known writing system, organized complex governments, codified laws, and built an economy sophisticated enough to sustain thousands. In many ways, the blueprint of civilization begins with them. Their gods were not distant abstractions, but powerful and often unpredictable forces who demanded devotion and shaped every aspect of daily life. Their kings ruled not only as political leaders but as divine representatives, commanding labor, waging wars, and raising monumental structures in honor of the heavens. From irrigation systems that transformed dry plains into farmland, to advances in mathematics, astronomy, and literature, their innovations still ripple through our modern world. Yet for all their achievements, mystery surrounds them. Who were these people who appeared so suddenly in the archaeological record? Where did they come from before they built their cities of mud, brick, and reed? And how did such a powerful civilization eventually fade from dominance? Today, we're diving into the story of the Sumerians, the architects of the first civilization in human history and the legacy they left behind. Origins of the Sumerians. This is southern Mesopotamia, the vast, flat plain where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spill into the Persian Gulf. At first glance, it is not an obvious birthplace for civilization. The land is heavy with clay and thick reeds. There are no forests for timber, almost no stone for construction, and a striking shortage of metals and other natural resources. It is a landscape that seems to resist permanence. The two great rivers flood regularly, depositing rich layers of fertile silt that make agriculture possible. But unlike the dependable rhythm of the Nile in Egypt, the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates are unpredictable and often destructive. They can shift course without warning, swallowing fields and settlements, transforming productive farmland into marshy, uninhabitable swampland. Survival here required planning, cooperation, and constant adaptation. And yet, it was in this demanding environment that the first great civilization, the Sumerians, took root. The origins of the Sumerians remain one of the great unresolved mysteries of ancient history. Before their emergence, the region was already home to two important archaeological cultures, the Ubaid and the Uruk. The Ubaid people had laid much of the groundwork. They constructed early irrigation systems, built mud brick temples, and produced distinctive painted pottery. Their settlements show signs of organized communities and shared religious practices. After them came the Uruk culture, which pushed development even further. The people of Uruk began constructing the first true cities, erecting monumental temple complexes, and experimenting with early administrative systems. They even developed a form of proto-writing using clay tokens to track goods and transactions. Then, near the end of the 4th millennium BC, the Sumerians appeared. But who were they? There are several competing theories. Some scholars argue that the Sumerians were indigenous to Mesopotamia, direct descendants of the Ubaid and Uruk populations who gradually evolved into a more complex society. This theory suggests continuity rather than migration. However, linguistic evidence complicates that view. The Sumerian language is unique. It does not belong to any known language family and has no clearly identifiable relatives. Even more puzzling, the names of major Sumerian cities such as Nippur and Lagash do not appear to be Sumerian in origin. Archaeological evidence shows that settlements already existed at many of these sites before Sumerian speakers dominated them. River names, lake names, and even essential agricultural terms like plow, farmer, and so appear to have been borrowed from earlier languages. This suggests that Sumerian speakers may have entered the region from elsewhere and adopted elements of the existing culture while establishing their own dominance. So where did they come from? According to Sumerian mythology, their ancestors arrived by sea from a distant paradise known as Tilman, often associated with modern-day Bahrain. Interestingly, archaeologists have uncovered traces of ancient connections between Mesopotamia and Dilmun, including trade links and cultural exchange. However, the earliest evidence of Sumerians in Mesopotamia predates clear archaeological evidence from Dilmun, making this explanation uncertain. Other theories stretch even farther. Polish Assyriologist scholars have suggested possible connections to the people who later established the Indus Valley civilization. Others have proposed origins in Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Arabian Peninsula, or even regions as distant as Tibet. Each hypothesis attempts to account for the linguistic isolation and sudden cultural emergence of the Sumerians, but none has been definitively proven. In the end, the truth remains elusive. The Sumerians appear in the historical record with astonishing sophistication: cities, temples, writing, administration, yet their beginnings are shrouded in silence. Their language stands alone. Their roots remain debated. And so, the first civilization in human history begins not with certainty but with a question.
The urban revolution around the transition from the 4th to the 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamia underwent a transformation unlike anything humanity had seen before. What had once been scattered farming villages began swelling into dense, organized urban centers. This was more than population growth, it was a structural shift in how humans live together. For the first time in history, cities emerged not as temporary clusters, but as permanent, complex systems. As these settlements expanded, daily life changed dramatically. When food production became more efficient, not everyone needed to farm or herd livestock. A surplus allowed society to diversify. Labor became specialized. Alongside farmers and shepherds, there were now potters shaping clay, metalworkers forging tools, merchants facilitating trade, administrators keeping records, priests conducting rituals, and warriors defending city walls. Work was no longer defined solely by survival, it became defined by skill and role. This shift marked a turning point in human organization. At the heart of this revolution were the Sumerian sophisticated irrigation systems. The Tigris and Euphrates could be both generous and destructive, flooding unpredictably and shifting course without warning. To tame these rivers, the Sumerians engineered vast networks of canals, dikes, levees, and reservoirs. Water was redirected, stored, and distributed with remarkable precision. Agriculture no longer depended solely on nature's timing, it depended on human planning. The scale of these systems was immense. A typical Sumerian city-state controlled roughly 300 square kilometers of territory, an area comparable to modern-day Queens in New York City. This landscape was not empty desert, but a carefully managed web of farmland and waterways, all requiring constant maintenance. Canals had to be cleared of silt, embankments repaired, water levels monitored. One failure could mean famine. Such coordination demanded leadership. Thousands of laborers had to work in unison, guided by overseers who tracked resources and organized manpower. Over time, those responsible for managing irrigation, storing grain, and directing labor accumulated authority. Administrative roles evolved into political power. Religious leaders, who claimed divine sanction for controlling the waters and ensuring prosperity, reinforced this hierarchy. From these foundations, an elite class emerged, one that governed not only land, but people. In attempting to master the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians did something even more profound. They mastered organization, and from that effort, out of canals, clay, and collective labor, the world's first urban civilization was born. City management in southern Mesopotamia. Dozens of cities emerged: Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and many more. One of the most important was Nippur, the religious center of all summer. It housed the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. Altogether, around 20 city-states developed within a relatively small area, often competing and warring with one another. Each city was governed by an ensi, not just a political leader, but also the high priest and chief administrator. The ensi was responsible for overseeing irrigation, organizing construction projects, managing temples, collecting taxes, and performing religious ceremonies. His title literally meant the one who divides the temple land, since all land was believed to belong to the gods. But the ensi didn't have absolute power. His decisions were checked by a council of elders, respected members of the community, and by citizen assemblies called to discuss major public matters. In some cities, The Insi also commanded a temple guard, an armed force that protected sacred property. In others, especially during war, a separate leader was chosen, the Lugal, which means big man. At first, the role of Lugal was temporary, meant for emergencies. But over time, it became permanent and eventually hereditary. As Lugals gained more authority, they took control of the military, administration, and religion, while the Insi gradually became a subordinate figure more like a mayor or a high priest under royal authority. This shift marked the rise of monarchy in Sumer. Early dynastic period. At the dawn of the 3rd millennium BC, Sumerian society entered a decisive new phase. The foundations laid during the urban revolution solidified into structured political systems. Cities were no longer just economic hubs, they were centers of power, each ruled by dynasties that claimed authority over both land and people. Leadership became hereditary, and governance more formalized. The age of competing kings had begun. Our most important written window into this era is the Sumerian king list, preserved most famously on the well-Blundell prism. This remarkable artifact records a succession of rulers from various Sumerian cities, stretching back into what it presents as deep antiquity. It begins in a mythic age, an era when kings were said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years, their reigns clearly symbolic rather than historical. But as the list progresses closer to the early dynastic period, something changes. The reign lengths shorten. The names become familiar from inscriptions and archaeological discoveries. Independent records begin to confirm certain rulers and cities. Myth gradually gives way to history. What starts as legend slowly transitions into documented political reality. The early dynastic period itself was defined by fragmentation and rivalry. Sumer was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states. Cities like Kish, Uruk, Lagesh, and Nippur competed constantly for dominance. Alliances were formed and broken. Borders shifted. Victories were often temporary. Kish appears in the king list as the first city to hold kingship after the mythical flood, suggesting its early prestige. For a time, it stood as a center of power. Later, authority shifted to Uruk, a city already ancient by this point and deeply tied to heroic traditions, including those surrounding the legendary figure Gilgamesh. Yet even as certain cities rose above others, their supremacy was rarely permanent. Despite warfare and ambition, there was no lasting unification of Sumer during this era. Each city guarded its independence. Each maintained its own patron deity, temple complex, rituals, and civic identity. Political power was local. Religious devotion was local. Loyalty was to the city before anything else. And yet, beneath the instability, something enduring was taking shape. During this period, the essential institutions of Sumerian civilization crystallized. Kingship became defined. Temple economies matured. Bureaucratic administration expanded. Writing evolved beyond simple accounting into royal inscriptions and historical records. Legal concepts, religious structures, and social hierarchies became firmly embedded in daily life. These developments would outlast the rivalries that produced them. The early dynastic period was not an age of unity, but it was an age of formation. The political, religious, and cultural frameworks forged in these centuries would later be adapted, and expanded by Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. In the struggle between city-states, the blueprint of Mesopotamian civilization was written. Invention of writing. Development of writing was a slow process that unfolded over thousands of years. It all started with the basic needs of early farming communities. Once people began producing food surpluses and trading goods, the need to keep records became essential. In the beginning, people across the ancient Near East used small clay tokens to represent goods like livestock, grain, or textiles. Then, around 3300 BC, temple officials in the city of Uruk came up with a brilliant idea. Instead of storing the tokens themselves, why not press them into soft clay to record the information? This small change sparked the earliest form of writing. Soon after, people started drawing basic pictograms directly into the clay: a sheep, a loaf of bread, a person. Over time, these signs evolved to become increasingly abstract. Then the Sumerians made another giant leap. They realized that symbols could represent sounds, not just meanings. This made it possible to write full sentences with grammar, tone, and all the complexity of spoken language. Sumerian scribes used a reed stylus to press marks into soft clay, which left wedge-shaped impressions. That's why we call the script cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Clay, as it turns out, was an incredibly durable material. More than 1 million cuneiform tablets have survived to this day, and archaeologists are still uncovering new ones. Sumerian technology speed writing. The Sumerians came up with a surprising number of innovations. One of their most important inventions was the plow. It revolutionized farming by making it more efficient, which freed up time for specialization. Their most famous invention, though, is probably the wheel. The earliest wheeled carts were likely used in religious rituals, but eventually, the Sumerians developed the first war chariots. In architecture, they were the first to build with arches and columns. Their most iconic buildings were ziggurats, massive, terraced temple towers that seemed to reach towards the sky. We also get a glimpse of their craftsmanship from the royal tombs of Ur, where archaeologists found stunning artifacts, intricate jewelry, and even board games crafted from gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. Even something as ordinary as soap was a Sumerian invention. And yes, they also invented beer. They even had a goddess of beer named Ninkasi. Since they didn't filter it, Sumerian beer was thick and chunky, and people drank it through straws from large ceramic jars. Sumerian science. Sumerians' most influential contribution to mathematics was the invention of the base 60 number system, known as sexagesimal, because they counted the 12 finger segments on one hand and used the 5 fingers of the other hand to keep track of each set. We still have 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle today. They were just as forward-thinking in astronomy. They compiled the first star catalogs and tracked planetary movements. Their calendar was based on lunar cycles, and even the 7-day week traces back to summer. The Sumerians were also legal pioneers, creating some of the earliest known law codes long before the famous Code of Hammurabi. Akkadian Empire and Gutian invasion. For centuries, the Sumerians and Akkadians coexisted. A major turning point came in the late 24th century BC with the rise of Sargon the Great, the founder of the world's first empire. Under Sargon, the Sumerian city-states were brought under a single rule. His domain was the first known attempt to create a centralized, multi-ethnic state. However, that golden age was short-lived. Around 2200 BC, the Gutians, a tribal people from the Zagros Mountains, began raiding and eventually took control of most of Mesopotamia. This period is often referred to as Mesopotamia's first dark age. Agriculture suffered, and the economy collapsed until Utu-Hengel, the ruler of Uruk, finally drove them out around 2120 BC. Third dynasty of Ur and decline for the Gutians were driven out. Leadership passed to Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur. He reunified the region and built the great ziggurat of Ur. Although Akkadian had become the common spoken language, Sumerian was restored as the official language of administration and religion. But beneath the surface, problems were growing. Over-irrigation had caused salinization of the soil, reducing crop yields. Economic challenges were made worse by the Amorites moving in from the west and the Elamites pushing from the east. In 2004 BC, the Elamites delivered the final fatal blow, sacking the city of Uruk. With the fall of Uruk, the era of Sumerian statehood came to an end. Sumerian disappeared from daily life, surviving only as a scholarly language, much like Latin, but their legacy lived on. The Sumerians vanished as a distinct people, but they laid the intellectual and institutional foundations of civilization itself.
Once again, if you've made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed to Signal 49. It really means a lot and helps us keep going. We hope to see you next time.